Why do we fear? Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to those of you joining online. This, as Chris said, is the first of our new series, and it's an adventure. In this series, we're going to be talking about emotions. I'm hoping that by the end of the series, those of you who stick with it throughout, you will be questioning all your emotions in a way that you never thought about before, and I'm going to apologise in advance if you do. Tonight, though, we are talking about what is perhaps the most fundamental, the most basal emotion we know of, which is the emotion of fear. And I think when you think about fear, in some ways, it's the easiest emotion to understand, right? So if you look at a painting like this, those of you who've been to my earlier lectures will know I'm a big fan of Turner. So here is Turner's Shipwreck. And I think in this picture, we can all feel ourselves and feel that feeling of fear, right? If you're on this boat in those kind of waves, they're pretty big, I think most of us would be afraid. And we were afraid for a very good reason, which is that you might die, right? So fear, in some senses, is the most evolutionary conserved process, and it's perhaps the easiest to understand because it keeps us alive. It's also one of the most basal experiences we have, and I can demonstrate that quite easily. Because when something like that happens, it's quite funny for those of you in the audience. I can watch you all going. Ugh. Those of you at home, I have no idea whether you're wondering what happened. But in the audience, people visibly shrink because this process taps into our most kind of fundamental feelings. So here, what has happened in front of you is something that is ostensibly quite scary has appeared. And actually, in this case, it is scary. This is a black widow spider, so it is a potentially lethal foe, if you like. If it bites you, you're in trouble. It's also about 10 foot big on this screen, and I think it's quite reasonable for all of us in the hall to be scared of a 10 foot big, poisonous spider. And just to augment that, there is this sound, this audio process that comes with it, of someone screaming, which is a really visceral signal that something problematic is happening. And what is really fascinating, I think, is probably indeed, as happened here in the hall, we respond to this incredibly fast, right? Before we've really thought about it, that's scary. And it makes a lot of sense when you see something like a 10-foot poisonous spider. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you see something like this. And yet, hopefully no one's actually doing it in the hall. There are people in the world who would find this just as scary. If you have what's called electrophobia, which is the profound fear of chickens, this fluffy chick is a pretty terrifying vision. And so one of the things I want us to think about this evening is what is going wrong in this process when someone is just as scared of a small fluffy chick as they are of a 10-foot poisonous spider, and is there anything we can do about that? So let's start by thinking about the kind of biology of fear. Where does it come from and how does it happen? And understandably, like all our emotions, its root is in the brain, okay? So as far as we know, people who are brain dead don't experience emotions. You need a brain to have some kind of processing of emotion. There's an interesting question that we'll talk about later in the series about where does this come in the evolutionary tree? How much of a brain do you need to have an emotion? But certainly for humans, we need a brain to have an emotion. And in particular, we need two bits of the brain that are critically important. The first is this region that's arrowed here, the hypothalamus, deep in the kind of close to the brain stem, in the middle of your brain. And this is the part of your brain that regulates so-called autonomic nervous system. So it regulates things like breathing, like blood pressure, etc., the basic functions of your body. Sitting right next to it are a pair of areas called the amygdala, which derives from this name for almond shape, because they are apparently almond shape. I've never actually seen one in real life, but they sit right next to the hypothalamus, again in the brainstem. And it's not a coincidence that these areas that control fear are so close to the core of the brain, because fear is probably, of all the emotions, is the one you need to activate very, very fast. In fact, you need to do so without thinking. Because when something like that happens, sorry for the lady who jumped out of her skin there, when that happens, you have processed a shock before you've actually thought about it, right? So for those of you who were sitting in the back near the speakers and went, gunshot, you actually went, before you thought gunshot, and certainly before you thought there's not actually someone in this hall shooting me. Because what has happened is your brainstem has processed the fear response before the higher parts of your brain have thought about what's actually going on. And it's for that reason that if you open a cupboard at home and a sock falls out, you might go, "Bah, it's a mouse," before you've realized. You've seen it, right? You know that's a sock, but your brain has not processed the sock image before the hypothalamus and your amygdala have processed the immediate fear response. The other very interesting thing about that is your biology has now kicked in and it's sort of too late. So, for example, that gunshot might have caused you to jump, might have caused you to elevate your blood pressure to you get a higher heart rate. And it'll take a little bit of time for that to calm down. And that's the reason why when a sock falls out of the cupboard and we think it's a mouse, even for a few seconds afterwards, you think, "Oh, that was quite scary," because the biology takes longer to damp down than your brain takes to turn off the fear response. And that is because, at its heart, fear is a very biological response, and it is driven by hormonal signaling. In particular, this guy here, adrenaline, which is a potent hormone that is driving many of the fear responses. So what happens when fear triggers something in your brain, so when you see that spider or indeed those fluffy chickens, if you're afraid of them, is that the combination of the hypothalamus and the amygdala is triggering the release of fear hormones, particularly adrenaline, from the adrenal glands close to your kidneys. That enters the circulation and immediately drives a series of responses that actually are evolutionarily very, very sensible. So, for example, it elevates the rate at which your heart beats, so you get, as we all know, this kind of pounding heart feeling. It constricts your blood vessels to raise blood pressure. You feel sweat because you might need to start cooling yourself off if you're going to run away. All of these things make a lot of sense in terms of being ready for what we call the fight or flight response. In other words, you're priming your body without even thinking about it to deal with that threat that you have perceived, either run away from the spider or to punch it on the nose and fight back. And so this biological response is critically important. You also get some very interesting responses, which again make sense, but we don't think of that obviously. And perhaps the most obvious one is this process here, when not at this speed, but when your pupil, dilates. So when you see something that you find scary, your pupil immediately gets bigger in the same way that it does when it gets dark, okay? Why is that? It's doing that because your body is prioritizing the ability to see things vaguely over the ability to focus on a particular issue. So for example, and that makes sense, right? If you're out in the jungle and you think there might be a tiger, you don't need to resolve the stripes on the tiger, you just need to know where it is. So it's diluting the pupil so that you get maximum light in and you very rapidly work out where something is, even if you don't really know what it is. And of course, this process is part of what plays into things like spooky houses. If you go to the fairground, whatever, it's dark, you can't really see, but you'll get this heightened perception because your pupil is dilating and you're getting kind of bombarded by slightly vague signals through the eye. And actually, this is a cool bit of biology which Hollywood tapped into a long time ago, and filmmakers now, particularly in high-end studios that are trying to achieve a scary effect, when they do their audience testing, they will fit people with pupil measuring devices to look at the expansion of the pupil, and they know they've got a good film if people go "whoa" with their pupil when they're doing it. So even if the audience can't really lie, you might say that wasn't that scary actually, but they've got the data that shows it was scary because your pupil dilated. So fear is a very, very biological response, okay? And like all of our emotions, this is something that's rooted in the behavior of our organs and the behavior of our hormones. One of the ways we know that, of course, like many, many things in biology, is from when this process goes wrong. And in particular, we know a huge amount from unfortunate people who have damage somewhere in this system. And actually, one of the most famous cases is this unfortunate lady known in the literature as SM. And SM was born with a very, very rare genetic disorder called Urbach-Vita syndrome, which is a genetic disorder in which slowly over time, parts of the brain calcify and die, essentially. And in SM's case, unfortunately, the part of her brain which calcified and died is the amygdala. And you can see here, I think, just about this kind of gap where the amygdala on your left There is a healthy brain, and on this side here you can see SM's brain. You see these two gaps, pairwise gaps. Her amygdalae have died, and as a result, she doesn't really feel fear. And SM has taught us a huge amount. So she doesn't perceive fear in the sense of somebody wielding a weapon, for example. She doesn't perceive fear when people do things that the most of us find slightly uncomfortable, like stand very, very close to this unfortunate gentleman here and get into your zone, which actually, we're sort of, he's stuck on the seat, sorry. But that feels uncomfortable to most of us. She doesn't notice that. She doesn't perceive risky situations, so dark or light doesn't make much difference to her. And as a result, unfortunately, SM has had an extremely hard life. She has been the victim of serious domestic violence. She has been mugged in many conditions. She lives in a part of the US which is extremely risky, and she's lived in sort of poverty and social deprivation most of her life. Partly, of course, because she's not perceiving the signals that the rest of us do about risk. What is particularly interesting, I think, in her case is that although she has had what by any measure is a really, really sad and difficult life, she is not unhappy. She is actually much more sort of jolly than the rest of us. She's not depressed. She's not, having many of the symptoms that lots of us would have in that circumstance, which I think tells us something about how the brain processes fear. So she hasn't been afraid. She's been in difficult situations, but it also hasn't had a knock-on effect. And that, I think, is something that is potentially useful to us in understanding how we might treat fear when it becomes debilitating. So, for example, when people have suffered extreme trauma, we might be able to learn something from that about how we can help those people recover. One of the interesting things about that biological process, so when the amygdala dysfunctions, your perception of fear goes wrong and your response to fear goes wrong. The other way around is also true. So when your own biology is responding in a way that is associated with fear, your brain detects that as a fearful response. And actually, there's a really great example I love of this, where volunteers were exposed to scary situations. And in this particular case, they were exposed to a horror movie. Those of you, I actually hate horror movies, so I haven't seen this, but if you've seen horror movies, apparently very scary. And in this particular case, volunteers watched the horror movies. Some of them, they were all injected beforehand, some with a placebo, some with adrenaline. Okay? And it turns out afterwards that the ones who had adrenaline rated the movie as scarier. Their pupil reflex, their dilation pupil was stronger, and they had a more potent memory of the film than those people who had the placebo. There's no difference in their intrinsic ability to detect fear, but what has happened is biological feedback. The adrenaline they were given raised their pulse rate, raised their kind of physiology, and because they felt kind of slightly hyped up, they then perceived the movie as much scarier. I think there's two very interesting things to take home there. So one is that if we can intervene in that physiological response, we might be able to help people's kind of mental response to fearful situations. And so actually, the very wise advice that people give, like, if you're in a scary situation, take a deep breath and calm down, is quite sensible. The second thing that I think we learn from this is that the more scary a response is, the stronger the memory it makes of it. And that makes sense, right? So evolutionarily, if you've had a narrow escape from a snake, you really, really want to remember what that snake was next time around and not rediscover it next time you meet the same snake. So very fearful things drive very, very strong memories. And that is a very useful and protective response most of the time. It's not a great response if, for example, you happen to see a pink balloon when someone mugged you, and forever afterwards you're associating pink balloons with a massive threat. And so I think being able to distinguish these physiological and emotional responses might help us treat people who have pathological, if you like, associations of fear with particular things. So there's a lot to learn, I think, from the kind of interface between the brain and the biology. And I think that is particularly relevant and particularly powerful if we can apply it to the most sort of debilitating conditions, the most difficult situations where people's fear goes horribly wrong. And in fact, this is anecdotally increasingly a problem around the world. We know that there are a variety of situations in which people feel fearful, and they shouldn't, in which people cannot disengage from fearful experiences, and in many cases which really, really impact on their ability to live a normal life. One of the best examples, perhaps, are people who have panic disorders. A panic disorder is defined as having repeated, otherwise unexplained periods of panic. So not panicking because someone's coming at you with a knife, but having what we might call a panic attack, and then having it on multiple occasions. And very depressingly, this is actually much more common than you might think. So these are now quite old data from the US, but the numbers have not gone down. Roughly speaking, about 2.7% of people overall have suffered a panic disorder in the last year. So that's quite a significant number of people whose lives have been very impacted. There are a couple of very interesting things, I think, in this graph that tell us a bit about what we might learn. So one is this quite profound gender difference. So it's about twice as common in women as men. We don't really know the reason for that. Some of that is possibly about long-standing evolutionary biology. So if you think back over millions of years, generally speaking, there was far more violence of men against women than the other way around, for example. So in some senses, it probably made evolutionary sense to be more predisposed to fear. But it may also represent an interesting interplay between genetics and possibly also hormonal signaling. So there's some evidence that during the menstrual cycle, fear detection changes, for instance. And we don't really understand that. The other one, I think, which is very interesting, is this one over here about age, where essentially what it's showing is that your risk of panic disorder is pretty much flat for most of your life, and then it suddenly plummets in older age. And there's a slightly depressing part of that, which is that if you suffer from panic disorder, very sadly, many people will take their own lives. And so there is obviously a kind of reporting bias here that impacts over time. That is nowhere near big enough, happily, to explain this drop. So something else is happening biologically. And one plausible hypothesis that is yet to be proven is that this may be about very low-level kind of brain degeneration that starts to kick in as you get older. And it's possible that one of the first parts that's kind of dampened down is this extreme fear perception, which I guess for those of us who are sort of inching our way towards this category here, maybe that's a slight consolation about the brain degeneration, is that we'll also be a bit less scared of stuff. But I think there's a lot of interest here in trying to understand this, because I think by understanding these kind of differences, you might learn a lot about the kind of underlying biology. But what else might we be able to learn about in terms of these kind of disorders where fear goes wrong? And there's been a lot of interest in trying to understand whether particular people are at more risk of panic disorder in particular, but related, fear-related disorders. And there has been quite a big investment in doing particularly genetics to try and understand what sort of genetic variation might predispose people, if any, to fear disorders. And the upshot of that essentially is lots of candidate genes, very little really robust information, except for one. And this is the one. So this is a protein produced by a single gene, which revels in the delightful name of catechol O-methyltransferase. There's a test afterwards to see if you remember that. This is an enzyme that we produce. It is, like all of our enzymes, encoded by a gene in our DNA, and it turns out that this gene is quite variable, actually, and all of us in this room might have slightly different variants of that gene. There is one version that is relatively common in which there has been a single amino acid change. So this whole protein that's made, like all proteins, of lots of amino acids, one letter, if you like, of that protein has changed. And it turns out that that change makes this enzyme far less efficient. It still works, but less efficiently. That is very important because the role of this enzyme is to break down catecholamines, which are neurotransmitters, and they include things like adrenaline. And so what this enzyme is doing is breaking down those neurotransmitters, those hormones that trigger a lot of the kind of fear response. And so it sort of makes plausible sense that if you're not breaking down some of the signaling molecules that are driving your fear response, you're going to have a more profound, longer-lasting fear response than otherwise. And it turns out that this particular variant of the gene is much more common in people who suffer from panic disorders. It is clearly, like most genetic effects, not black and white. If you have that version of the gene, you're not going to definitely get panic disorder. And conversely, if you suffer from panic disorders, you might not have this variation. But it does increase your risk. And that, I think, is so both interesting and helpful potentially, because it sort of suggests a way that you might, for starters, be able to identify people who are at a higher risk of panic disorder. But you might also think about long-term medication that can help with those people. If your problem is breaking down those fear substances, perhaps we can develop medicines that help break it down faster and help recover people from that loop of fear. So that's one correlation. It's not enough to explain all panic disorders by any measure. There are lots of other things that are being looked at. One of the things, I think the most interesting, although far from proven ideas here, is that people who suffer from panic disorders may be more sensitive to normal fear-inducing stimuli than the rest of us. And the one in particular that is of interest is they may be much more sensitive to CO2 levels. So our bodies, in fact all animal bodies, are very, very well adapted to sensing CO2 levels, and rising CO2 levels triggers panic, okay? So if I was to start flooding this room with CO2, I don't worry, I'm not going to do that. If I was to start flooding this room with CO2, very, very rapidly, despite anything you did, you would all feel extreme panic and would be running for the exit. Good way to clear the hall at the end. And that is true for other animals too. So rising CO2 is a very potent way of inducing panic. There is some suggestion that people with panic disorder may be more finely tuned to this. And so one idea is that people, particularly people who experience panic disorder in places like indoor environments, crowded environments, train carriages, they may be doing something that's entirely rational. They may be responding to a rising CO2 level because everyone's breathing, but just at a much lower level than the rest of us are. That's far from proven, but I think quite interesting. And actually, again, offers a potential solution, or at least a treatment. You know, if you could just open a window and reduce CO2 levels and get everyone much better, that'd be a great, way of tackling this problem. Again, far from proven, but very interesting. One of the most interesting things I think about this CO2 response also is that it does not need the amygdala to trigger it. So patient SM, that we talked about a few minutes ago, responds to rising CO2. And actually there was a very fascinating experiment, which ironically she saw the funny side of, I think, in which she was fitted with a mask and CO2 was pumped in, and she panicked. She tore the mask off and she ran away from the thing. And afterwards, they asked her about it, and she said that was an entirely novel experience. How cool. Because she'd never felt fear like that before. And so that tells us that despite the absence of amygdala fear functions, that CO2 fear function is still very basal. And in fact, that's true. I mean, most animals panic in the presence of CO2, but obviously it's much harder to make an animal panic with a horror movie. So there is clearly a very basal evolutionary response to rising CO2. So those are panic disorders. Those are places where our natural fear response has gone wrong, or has gone overactive, if you like. But what about normal life? And I'm sure, all of us in this hall have differences, right? I suspect many of us, when we're out and about, we have, well, in my case, I have kids who love a roller coaster. I can't look at a roller coaster without feeling slightly sweaty palmed. We all know people who are apparently, they say, oh, my ideal holiday is, I don't know, backpacking through Colombia, and I might get mugged, but who cares? And there are other people who are like, a day trip to Milton Keynes, that's pretty scary. So we vary in our fear response. So why do we vary in our fear response? In some senses, that doesn't make sense, right? Evolutionarily, you'd imagine that, you should be scared of some things and not scared of others. And that's the same for all of us. And yet that is not the same for all of us. We all have variation in terms of how much we fear. And I think one of the places we vary most is in our phobias. So for example, a picture like this, I have to say, as someone who doesn't do heights, I can't really look at that without feeling slightly let's move to the next slide. Whereas there will be some of you in this audience looking at that going, what a great day out. I'd love to be where that guy is. That, to me, doesn't make sense. He's going to fall off and he's going to die. That's quite scary. This is not a fun day out. And yet many of you will have the opposite view. So we vary a lot in our fear responses. Why do we vary so much in our fear response? Partly, we know that we vary a lot because of our genetics. We don't really know how, but we know that particularly fear disorders, like the one we've been talking about, have quite a strong heritability component, between about 30 and 50%. In other words, if you're suffering from things like panic attacks, at least pushing towards half of that is about some kind of blend of genetics. There has been a lot of work in trying to understand what those genetic variants are that influence our different perceptions of fear. And in particular, there's been a lot of work using what's called a GWAS approach, so a genome-wide association study. So in those kind of studies, what you do is you take a whole bunch of people, so let's imagine all of you in this room, and we sequence your DNA, and then we look at things that correlate with some particular behavior. So maybe I'm going to divide the room up into those of you who love roller coasters and those of you who don't even want to look at them. And we look at genes that are shared in one group and not present in the other group. And that gives you some idea about, it doesn't prove anything, but it gives a suggestion that, there's a gene for loving roller coasters or hating roller coasters. So people have done that, and what you find, unsurprisingly, is a very large number of genes that have some correlation with kind of fear responses. In fact, it's pushing on towards 100 different genes. But one of the very interesting things I think about that is there is a kind of cluster of behaviors. And so actually in all those genes that people have associated with fear, there's quite a strong signal for something called GABA signaling. So GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is a neurotransmitter that we use, humans use, other animals use too, to do a whole variety of things in the brain. And it turns out that a lot of these genes that associate with fear responses have a role to play in either producing or breaking down this neurotransmitter GABA. So that suggests to me, at least, and to others, that this signaling through this GABA pathway is probably partly to do with our differential fear response. And so in some senses, what you have perhaps is a kind of black and white fear response driven by adrenaline, driven by that acute process, but then it's tuned by this broader range of neurotransmitters, including GABA, which are kind of accelerating it a bit or reducing it a bit. And therefore that our kind of personal experience of fear might be more about these kind of tuning factors than about the kind of core response itself. There's another reason that's quite interesting, is that this GABA axis is one that actually there's been a lot of interest in, and you can fiddle with in lots of different ways, including with diet. So we know that you can change people's GABA levels by dietary intake. And so that, I think, offers an interesting dimension about whether in the future we might be able to think about, literally feel-good foods that use this route to start influencing people's fear response. So that's about fear and about why you are frightened of things. The opposite of fear, of course, is this idea of bravery. And we all know, as well as people who are terrified of roller coasters like me, we know people who are apparently very brave or sometimes stupid and tackle problems that the rest of us don't dare to do. We know much less about the sort of genetic disposition of bravery, and we don't have, sadly, a magical wand around a particular gene that drives bravery, much as some of us would like it. But we do know that sometimes the impact on bravery and on fear, the opposite of fear, if you like, is coming from very unusual places. And one of the things that has most fascinated me as a sort of infectious diseases person, really, is the idea that some of our fear and bravery responses are not coming from us ourselves, but they're coming from our microbial passengers that live in us. And the best known example of this is this little chap here. This is a parasite, Toxoplasma gondii, which some of you, especially ladies in the audience who've had children, might remember. So when you're pregnant, you're usually asked, or looked at to see whether you've been exposed to this parasite, because it's generally pretty harmless in humans, but it can be a problem for unborn babies. So this parasite turns out to be a very interesting parasite because it's not really a human parasite at all. In fact, it's a rodent parasite that lives in rats and mice and things. But like many parasites, it needs two different hosts to complete its life cycle. So it lives in a rodent, it replicates in a rodent, but it cannot complete its life cycle unless it gets into a feline, so like a domestic cat or a tiger or something. And so in order for the parasite to complete its life cycle, it really needs the cat to see the mouse, as you can see here, no pun deliberately intended. So it needs the cat to see the mouse and consume the mouse, okay? And so evolution is kind of sneaky and mean, but also quite amazing. And so what evolution has done is driven the parasite to develop ways to encourage mice to get eaten by cats. And the way that the parasite does that when it gets into the mouse is it removes the mouse's fear of felines. Mice are intrinsically afraid of cats. Makes a lot of sense if you're a mouse. And the parasite removes that. And you can see that here. In fact, it removes not only the mouse's fear of cats, but also the mouse's fear more generally. So here, hopefully, Oh, we're not going to see the first video, never mind. Okay, so in the top video, what you should see is a normal mouse doing mouse-like scared things. What you see in this lower video is a mouse that has been infected with Toxoplasma. And what you clearly see in this lower video is that that mouse is not as afraid as it should be. Those of you who've met a mouse, most of us have, mice live in the dark, they hide in corners, they do not run across the middle of a well-lit arena in broad daylight, because that's a bad thing to do if you're a mouse. And so what's happened to this mouse is it's been infected with the parasite, and the parasite has toned down the mouse's fear response. And in fact, one of the things that's particularly kind of amusing but also quite sad is that heavily infected mice start to like the smell of cat urine and hang around in cat litter trays, which if you're a mouse is a very, very short-lived hobby to get into, I think. So Toxoplasma is a kind of classic example of a parasite that is manipulating a fear response in an animal. So why am I telling you this? Unless you're a cat lover, you're not that interested. The reason I'm telling you this is because although this parasite has evolved to infect rodents and felines, it also gets into ourselves. Particularly if you do stuff like you empty your cat litter tray and don't wash your hands, then eat something. You can also pick it up from undercooked meat if the cysts are still in there, and you can get exposed to this. When it enters humans, we are a dead-end host. The parasite cannot go anywhere because we're generally not eaten by cats, happily. And so we're end of story for the parasite. But the parasite doesn't know that, right? It thinks you're a mouse, basically. And so what it does is it does what it does in the mouse. It forms a cyst either in your muscle tissue or sometimes in your brain tissue. So here is an example of someone who has a toxoplasma in their brain. That's the white blob you see in one side of their brain. You don't know. Okay, so this individual, for example, was in a car crash. They had an MRI scan because they'd been in a car crash, and they reveal the presence of the parasite. It wasn't symptomatic. And in fact, many of us have this, okay? So typically in the UK, infection rates are something like 30%. Not always in the brain, but 30%, 1 in 3. So I suggest you all look left, look right, and work out which one of you is carrying the parasite. So these are hiding out there in broad daylight. And we've thought for a long time that they are hiding with no symptoms at all. But it turns out that it's not completely true. So it turns out that if you have this parasite asymptomatically, apparently, you are actually more likely to be a risk taker than someone who doesn't. So you are twice as likely to crash your car, particularly in a crash that involves you taking a risk, running a red light, driving too fast, those kind of things. More positively, you're much more likely to open your own business than someone who doesn't have this parasite in your brain, which is also quite a risky kind of move, right? Opening your own business. Disappointingly, you're also about twice as likely to go bankrupt after you've opened your business as someone who doesn't have the parasite. And so all that together suggests that what the parasite is doing in our brains is not a million miles away from what it's doing in a mouse brain. It is modulating our fear responses, and it's making us think things like, yeah, you know what, I'll take out that loan on my business, it'll be okay, when those without the parasite might be a little bit more cautious. So this is a non-human part of our ecosystem. This is a microbe, if you like, that is modulating something that we think of as being intrinsically us, right? Am I a risk taker or not? That's me, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's my parasite. That, I think, is quite interesting. It's perhaps not that hard to imagine how that's working, right? This is a parasite sitting in your brain. It's feasible that it's fiddling with your brain chemistry and making you more afraid or less afraid in this case. What is much more fascinating, much harder to understand, but to me at least much cooler, is the fact that this may not be unique to parasites in the brain. And in fact, one of the places that we are most interested in this idea of emotional regulation is not the brain at all, but it's coming from the gut. So your gut, as you, I'm sure, all know, is absolutely rammed full of really cool and interesting microbes, about 37-ish trillion different ones, we think, in the average human. Certainly far more bacterial cells than you have human cells. And they're all sitting there digesting your dinner, your lunch, whatever you've just had, and doing all sorts of interesting things. We are increasingly familiar with the idea that gut health is really important, right? Having a healthy microbiome is good for your digestion, it's good for your overall fitness. Turns out it might also be good for your mental mood. Because within those 39 trillion bacteria are quite a lot of bacteria that either produce or break down human neurotransmitters. And in fact, the key neurotransmitter that is both made and broken down by the microbiome is GABA, that gamma-aminobutyric acid that we talked about a few slides ago. And you'll remember me saying that was the strong signal from a genome-wide association study. So your own genes regulating the amount of GABA you produce seem to be important for fear responses. But we also know that different bacteria either make it or break it down in your gut. We also know that it can cross into the bloodstream from the gut. And so actually it's entirely plausible that the amount of circulating GABA in your system is partly influenced by your microbiome. And therefore, if GABA is also influencing your fear response, it's entirely plausible that whether you're the kind of person who loves roller coasters or not is at least partly driven by the particular bacteria in your gut. And of course, the particular bacteria in your gut are very strongly driven by what you've just eaten. And so, when we talk about someone having lots of guts, we might literally mean they've got lots of guts because it's about their microbiome that's stimulating that. And that, I think, is really quite exciting in terms of where we may be able to kind of slightly tweak people's biology, if you like, in a very non-interventionist way. Wouldn't it be great if someone said, you've always wanted to go on a roller coaster, you find it too scary, eat this yogurt, you'll be fine. I think we're some way off that, but I think it's quite an interesting idea. We know quite a lot about that, actually, from some very interesting studies in mice. It's obviously quite difficult to do these studies in humans, but there's some interesting stuff in mice that has been done. In particular, if you look at your typical mouse, which is quite a scaredy mouse, right? So those of you who've met mice, they don't like coming out in daylight. They're scared of noises. They're scared of all sorts of things. Very sensible if you're a mouse. And mice, like humans, have their own microbiome. If you raise that mouse in a way that it has no microbiome, so-called germ-free mice, which you can do experimentally, you can raise a mouse that has no bacteria in its gut at all. And that mouse is significantly more anxious than a littermate, so a brother or sister, that has a microbiome, suggesting that indeed the absence of bacteria is actually not good for a fear response. It drives more fear response. And then one of the most interesting things is you can then restore a microbiome and you can tweak it to add particular species in abundance. And when you do that, you can come up with a microbiome that makes mice much braver than they perhaps should be. I don't think this is actually a real photo, by the way. But you can stimulate bravery in a mouse with a microbiome kind of transplant. So there's, at least from mice, experimental evidence that you can fiddle with the microbiome and you can make mice braver or more scared. So that's all kind of fascinating. Increasingly, I think it's getting harder and harder to imagine this. You can imagine a parasite fiddling with your brain. Now I'm asking you to imagine microbes in your gut fiddling with your brain. That's a bit harder to imagine. But the one I think is that I get a lot of questions about, and is even harder to imagine, but is also quite cool, is what about the smell of fear, right? We talk about this in films. People talk about the scent of fear, or you read if you're a reader of a particular type of fiction, it says he scented fear on the wind. You think, really? How did he do that? Is there any truth in that? If you're not a human, there's a huge amount of truth in that. So most rodents, for example, are extremely susceptible to the scent of danger rather than the scent of fear. So if you're a mouse, you're incredibly sensitive to the scent of any major predator, so cats in particular, but also dogs. And we know that, so for example, if you have a pet shop or a mouse facility or something like that, you have to go to quite extreme lengths to filter the air, because otherwise next door neighbor's cat walking past will really freak out your rodents. So there are definitely animals that perceive danger very, very sensitively by scent. That makes a lot of sense, because if you're a mouse, you definitely want to be able to smell if there's a cat coming, okay? Perhaps slightly more interesting is animals that can scent fear in unrelated animals. And the place that this has most been studied is in our friendly neighborhood dogs. And so those of you who are dog owners might anecdotally feel this. Quite a lot of people who own dogs say, my dog is very sensitive to fear, or my child was upset and the dog was upset as well. And it turns out there's some kind of biological truth to that. So there is a great experiment, I love this experiment, where human volunteers were asked to watch either a feel-good movie, I don't know, it was some kind of rom-com or something, or a horror movie. And they watched it with cotton wool buds under their armpits. And then at the end of the movie, what happened was that dog owners were invited into the room, and the cotton wool was in the room, and then the response of their dog to a stranger in the room was noted. And it turns out that when dogs come in and the cotton wool in the room is from the people who watch the horror movie, that dog is more afraid of the stranger than if it's just an innocuous cotton wool ball from the rom-com. So the dog, I mean, when you think about this is quite amazing, right? The dog is perceiving the scent of fear in a human armpit from watching a horror movie and is responding in its own fearful way. So it turns out, so dogs genuinely can scent fear in somebody else, including their owners. And actually, so there's a lot of logic when people say when you're kind of training a dog, you need to be very calm, because if you're afraid, it will be afraid too. There's a very plausible biological mechanism for that, because rodents and indeed dogs have this organ called the vomeronasal organ in top of the nose here, which you can just about see in these two diagrams in blue. And the vomeronasal organ is all about detecting pheromones. So it's there for animals to perceive airborne odorants that are signaling molecules. And we don't know what that molecule is for fear, but we presume that this is the organ that is perceiving fear, even in the case of dogs perceiving it from humans. This organ is really important for lots of animals. So if you're a horse, if you keep horses, for example, you might have seen this behavior when horses, especially male horses, flare back their lip and go, and what they're doing is they're drawing air in over the vomeronasal organ to smell if a female horse is in season, essentially quite close by. And so they are deliberately scenting, if you like, behaviors through this organ. So it makes a lot of sense that for animals that do that, they should be able to perhaps detect fear as well. And it's not a million miles away to say, well, okay, those signals are probably very similar in humans and dogs, and therefore a dog might be sensing our own fear in that way. There is a really big problem for us as humans doing that, though, because we don't think we don't have one of these. It's not entirely clear, but we cannot see in human anatomy the equivalent of the vomeronasal organ. And probably more damningly, the genes that we know are really important for running this organ in mice and in dogs in humans are called pseudogenes. They have mutated, they don't produce a functional protein anymore, suggesting that we have sort of shut down our vomeronasal organ over evolutionary time, presumably because it wasn't so important. We relied on other signals to work out whether you were going to go on a hot date or not. We don't have to sniff people to know whether they're interested in you romantically. We have other ways of doing that. And so we've lost that ability. And so there is quite a powerful argument that we therefore have also lost the ability to perceive sort of fear and stress, except that there is a little bit of data suggesting that is not entirely true. And the experiment I most love in humans about this is this one here. I don't know who volunteers for these, but anyway, where they took a bunch of people who volunteered either to go running. That's not so scary. I mean, I don't like running, but it's not that scary. They either went running with sticky cotton wool pads under their armpits, or ridiculously, they did their first skydive with a sticky cotton wool pad. And the idea of this is that you sweat in both conditions, but only in the second condition are you terrified in fear of your life. And so the sweat that's going into those cotton wool balls will be either a fearful sweat or a non-fearful sweat. And then you aerosolize that and you let other volunteers sniff it. I think those are also quite brave. I'm not sure I want to sniff somebody else's armpit, but anyway, you let them sniff that. And then you ask what is happening in their brain. And it turns out that when you sniff the cotton wool ball from a skydiver, your amygdala lights up. And if you sniff it from a jogger, it doesn't. So you are responding with a fear response to that. And the other thing that I think is really cool is you also respond more fearfully to scary faces. I'm not sure this is a particularly scary face, but you respond more potently to scary faces. So your brain is perceiving a level of fear, and even if you don't feel fearful, you are kind of tuned into it. You're looking out for fear in other people. And so that suggests that even if we don't have a fully functional vomeronasal organ, we are somehow responding to these volatile, these scent-based signals of fear in other people. And that, I think, becomes very, very interesting in terms of thinking about how we might be able to better manage fear, particularly in sort of crowd conditions. So obviously one of the big worries that people have in organising things like football matches or large crowds generally is the idea that panic might set in. And so I think it's quite an interesting question for us there about could we exploit this to try and manage and prevent dangerous fear responses like panic stampedes or something. Unsurprisingly, because of that, one of the biggest areas of interest in the biology of fear has come from the military. I think that is as with many things to do with military research, a slightly nerve-wracking ethical dilemma. It might be one thing, I would be hugely supportive of people helping treat, post-traumatic stress disorder in returning troops, for example. I'd be a little bit more edgy about the idea that you might sow fear into your enemies by sprinkling some kind of smelly compound around the place. There's lots of interesting challenges ethically there, I think. But I think much more exciting and much more promising to me is the ability for us to learn enough about the biology of fear that in the future we may be able to help people whose lives have been blighted by fear in all sorts of different ways to get better, faster, and return to normal life. And so on that very optimistic note, I will finish. I hope you found that interesting and not fearful, and I look forward to your questions.